Let's help each other out. It's good to be able to compare notes and learn from each other and reject this culture of competition in academia. Scholars Unbound is a bi-monthly podcast or video series that showcases the voices of scholars who know no boundaries when it comes to the pursuit of knowledge. You will hear insights from their experiences as international scholars and how these influence their research, hoping to inspire future scholars to be fearless, global, and unbound. I'm your host, Dalia Simangon. It's been a year since I did the first interview for this podcast, and it was only fitting that in the previous episode published on September 1st, exactly a year after I started this project, we had Dr. Harvey Joy Liwanag and his work on decolonizing global health, and we also talk about decolonizing academia. I have some ideas brewing on how we can collectively work together to advance these conversations into how we study and how we do research and our everyday practice in academia. To focus on realizing these ideas, the Scholars Unbound podcast will take a break in November and December before starting with a brand new season in January 2022. The final 2 episodes this coming October will be on my reflection after a year into podcasting, and the other one will be about the Scholars Unbound plan for the next year. I'm really excited about this and I hope you are too, so please stay tuned for those final episodes in this first season. But before that, in this episode, I'd like to share and walk you through my process when revising an academic paper. We have different approaches in doing this, and what works for me may not necessarily work for you, and we may also have overlaps in this process that can help us improve our approaches. In grad school, I don't think there was a formal course on how to write a paper, much more so on revising one. We are kind of expected to be able to do this on our own, although that's not what happens most of the time. When I first received a revise and resubmit decision, the first thing I did after consolidating in my head the critiques and comments by the reviewers was to ask my supervisors what to do or how to approach a revision. I really had a very vague idea on how to do it, and the idea I had was based on more informal conversations with fellow graduate students, and of course these were helpful in giving me a general sense on how it should be done. But to have a clearer approach and some basic guidelines, I needed help. My supervisors were tremendously helpful. They gave me step-by-step advice on how to address the comments and even shared a sample response letter. These things now seemed simple, but before, they really enlightened me on the bigger picture of publishing in academic journals and the finer details of revising an article. Okay, so what's my process after I receive a major revision decision? First of all, I celebrate this as an achievement through very simple ways. That could be by adding a sticker on my planner or going for a much longer leisure walk during lunchtime or having a couple of drinks at the end of the day. As long as it's not a rejection, it's a win for me because the editor sees potential in my work, and I couldn't be thankful enough to the editors and reviewers who dedicated their unpaid time to reviewing my work. This is encouraging, especially for an early career researcher with a constant self-doubt like me. But if it's a rejection, it may not be a win, but it's also not a complete defeat. I invite you to listen to episode 24 on rising above rejections if you are faced with this challenge and how you can rethink and transform rejections into something that is useful. Now, the second step I do is I read the comments very carefully, word for word. If I am the corresponding author and I have co-authors, this is also the time that I inform them of the decision and let them know that I'm going to plan and share with them later the revision process. The third step is I reread my paper. Sometimes the review process takes months and I might have forgotten some of the specifics in my paper. Reading it again helps me refresh my memory, which is not excellent by the way, and condition myself to the task of revision. Rereading my paper also helps me locate the places the comments pertain to, maybe mark them and jot down some initial ideas on how to improve them. The fourth step is to pull out my revision plan template. This is a simple table, an adapted version of Dr. Raul Pacheco Vega's draft review matrix, which I will link in the show notes. Side note, if you don't know yet, Dr. Pacheco Vega's blog is a treasure trove of helpful tips on publishing in academia and many other great stuff in there too, so please do check that out. My revision plan template is a table of 4 columns: theme, comment, response, and target date. Under the first column, which is theme, I list down the usual components of a paper. So it will be rows on introduction, methods, results, discussion, and then conclusion. I also have another row for others, such as typographical and grammatical errors, additional references, and other minor points that do not fall under any of the themes. Then for the comment column, I copy-paste the reviewer's comments across the specific themes. So if a reviewer has a comment on the structure of my introduction, I will copy-paste that under the comment column beside the introduction theme. Sometimes there are general comments that do not necessarily require a response. For example, the reviewers may summarize the paper depending on how they understand it, or they have some positive feedback or negative feedback that's quite general. I copy-paste the generally positive feedback on top of my template. I find this as a good reminder or encouragement that my work is worth revising, especially when the revision gets tough. Having it on top means that I can easily read it whenever I open my revision plan. And you can guess where I put the negative feedback that doesn't need a response. Those are quite rare, by the way, because I believe reviewers in general are well-meaning in providing feedback, but general comments that are not constructive or downright mean stay in the decision letter. I don't copy-paste them in my revision plan. I don't include negative and unconstructive feedback in my template because those types of feedback cannot be addressed in a revision anyway and could be disheartening along the way. The third column is labeled as response, where I write my plan on how to respond to each of the comments or address each of the issues the reviewers raised. For example, if the reviewer comments that my introduction is all over the place and doesn't clearly state my argument, then I will note under the response my plan to restructure the introduction by moving the paragraphs or statements or by improving my signposting. Since the reviewer also observed that my argument is not clearly stated, I will also include in my plan that I will rephrase my argument to make it clearer and perhaps move it to somewhere that links more effectively with the rest of the introduction. And then for the fourth and final column, I write down when I plan to complete this item in my revision plan. What I usually do is I start with more difficult comments and then move on to minor ones. So I would probably have one day for, say, restructuring the introduction, another day or two for better engagement with the literature if that's what the reviewers ask for, and then group together the minor comments and address them all in a day. Examples of minor comments are typographical errors or adding citations or rephrasing unclear statements. Of course, I check the target dates against my schedule to find the days when I can focus solely on revising my paper. I know it's quite difficult for many of us to have large chunks of time for research and writing, so when I set the target date, I try as much as possible to protect my time. I have a past episode on how to reclaim your time by saying no, so if that's something that might interest you, I will link it in the show notes. I'd like to say at this point that you don't have to incorporate all the suggestions of the reviewers, but you need to justify the reasons why. So even though if there's a comment or suggestion that I don't agree with, I will write down under the response column the reason that justifies why I decided not to incorporate a comment or suggestion. For example, a reviewer may ask that I should add an explanation for something that I feel is outside the scope of my paper, then I will write that under my response. What's important here is that I will respond to all comments by the reviewers as well as the editors, regardless of whether I will incorporate their suggestions into my revision or not. In my experience, I can count with one hand the number of times I disagreed with the comments, So far, I've been very lucky to have received constructive and thoughtful comments. And we also need to remember that reviewers, most of the time at least, are our allies and they just want to help us improve our work. Now, going back to the table of revision plan, I find this table personally really helpful once I start writing my letter of response to the reviewers and editors. How to write a response letters for a different episode, but in general, I always remind myself to be specific in my response, adding page and line numbers, and even quoting the additional materials if they are not that long, and to be comprehensive, making sure that I address each of the comments. Once I am confident that I was able to address all the comments, I read my paper again at least twice. Once to refine it to make sure that the flow is intelligible, considering the new materials that I have added or materials that I have deleted. And once again, to proofread my paper for any typographical or grammatical errors or formatting guidelines. So to recap the steps in my revision process, first, I celebrate a major revision decision as a win. This helps me tackle the sometimes arduous task of revision ahead. Second, I read the comments by the reviewers and editors very carefully. Third, I reread my paper to help me get into the right mindset and generate initial ideas on how to revise the specific parts of my paper. The fourth is I detail my revision plan in my template where I categorize the comments, copy-paste them accordingly, write down my revision plan for each comment, and set a target date. And finally, I read again the revised paper for refining and proofreading. This is my approach in revising an academic paper, and I also would love to hear from you about your strategy, how you tackle a revision. You can send me an email at scholarsunbound@gmail.com, or you can even share in the email an audio recording of yourself if you want your views to be featured in the next episodes and reach more people who might benefit from your strategies. Let's help each other out. It's good to be able to compare notes and learn from each other and reject this culture of competition in academia. Thank you for listening to this episode. Please consider leaving a comment or rating at iTunes or any of your preferred podcast hosting platforms. For details about upcoming episodes and how to support the Scholars Unbound project, visit daliasimangan.com/scholarsunbound with the link in our show notes.